Hey, good morning. I want to welcome all of you here today. We should have an interesting program that would give us some insights into some of the issues going on today as far as upcoming disagreements on various issues. And anyway, I want to invite you and welcome you to today's program. I also want to remind you about our next program, which would be the first Wednesday of May, May 4th, where it'll be our annual meeting. But in addition to that, in beginning the program will be our presentation by John Shaw. So I welcome even non-league members to join that program, and then they can leave after John finishes, rather than sticking around for the annual meeting things. I'd now like to turn over the screen to Susan, who will introduce our speaker today.
Okay, thanks, Gail. And I'm happy to introduce our speaker today. Laura Van Abbema has studied history and classics at SIUC and holds a PhD in early European history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research areas include political satire and women in Imperial Rome. She currently works at the Survival Empowerment Center and serves on the Jackson County League of Women Voters Board. Okay, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you, Gail and Susan and Jennifer for hosting the public library for hosting today. This is a topic that I had discussed back in 2016, and a lot has happened since then. So this is really lessons from the end of the Roman Republic 2.0. And some seemingly trivial events had got me thinking about this again. One was when Trump, early in his presidency, issued these challenge coins, and he put Mar-a-Lago on there and also switched out E pluribus unum for Make America Great Again. And I thought that was a very Roman thing to do, as to use coins as propaganda. And also when he put his name on these stimulus checks, that is also a very what a would-be Roman emperor would do, distribute money to the people and then put up an inscription telling everyone that he did so. So, but the benefit of looking back to the Roman Republic is that we take ourselves out of the current divisive climate in which everyone seemed to be talking past one another. And the other benefit is that we recognize the influence of Roman history on the formation of our own republic. The founding fathers, like most statesmen and political thinkers of the time, like John Adams, were educated in the classics, and they looked to ancient Rome for answers. So this is really an appeal to everyone, no matter your political persuasion, basically an appeal to come to the center and to see how we can avoid an autocratic government. Could you, next slide, please? The significance of res publica, that's the word in Latin. It's simply translated, it means public matters. It's anything that relates to the governing of a polity. Scipio Aemilianus, in one of Cicero's dialogues, says that the quote, "a republic is the property of the public." So let's keep that in mind. When looking to ancient Rome, one trend to recognize is this blurring of public and private, as power is increasingly concentrated in the hands of one individual through a number of unprecedented steps. And against that trend are two other. We see the broadening of the national interest to include more people and resources, and also a rising number of conflicts between the patricians and the plebeians, or what we might call the optimates class or faction and the populares faction, but I'll come back to those terms. Cicero, oh, sorry, previous slide yet. Cicero and Polybius talk extensively about what made the Roman Republic great. And that was the concept of a mixed government. It was supposed to have elements of a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a democracy. The Republic itself was established in 510 BC after they overthrew the king Tarquinius Superbus. And one of those conspirators against the king was a man by the name of Lucius Junius Brutus. He is the ancestor of the Brutus who assassinates Julius Caesar. The consuls, the administrative offices are set up with the consuls at the very top and what's called a cursus honorum. This is a ladder of steps, a series of official positions or administrative offices that one would hold as they move up from quaestor to aedile, praetor to eventually consul. The consuls, of course, would be akin to our executive branch. They were the monarchic element. All magistrates have what's called imperium. That's the power to govern. Only praetors and consuls have the power to command military legions. And so when you were a governor in a province, you would receive either pro-praetorian or pro-consular command to carry out, to wage war, for example, against one's enemies. All of them would be accompanied by lictors, and the lictors would hold what's called the fasces. And you see in the bottom right of your screen there, it's kind of hard to make out, but it's a bundle of rods, and you can see the axe coming off the side there. That is the symbol of imperium. That is the symbol of your power to govern. It's initially, like I said, usually over military commands, but as we'll see, it comes to mean the power of life and death over Roman citizens themselves. We also see an office called the Dictatorship. This was a legitimate office in the Roman Republic. It was only used sparingly in times of crisis. A dictator would be appointed by the consuls on the decision of the Senate. And then after the crisis was averted, the idea would be that you would give up that power. So for example, early in the Roman Republic, in 458, a guy by the name of Cincinnatus assumed the dictatorship in order to prevail against the Aequi. And 6 months later, he gave up that authority when the war had ended, and he went back to his small farm as an independent private citizen. That's how it was supposed to work. You also see in this cursus honorum, the position of the tribune of the plebs or the plebeians. This is the common people. The office itself doesn't sit very well in this cursus honorum, but it was clear that the plebeians, as they wanted more power, they needed a representative in the government to represent their interests. The tribune was sacrosanct, inviolable. He could not be attacked physically. And the tribunes also had the power of veto, so they could block the decisions of any other magistrate except a dictator. And we'll see how this office is continually abused by the consuls and even other senators. Next slide. So the Senate is the aristocratic branch of government. They are the preeminent authority. It consists of the best citizens of the state. It was not hereditary, but many came from long distinguished families. Someone like Cicero, who is considered a novus homo or new man, he didn't have a distinguished background, but he could work his way up the cursus honorum and eventually attain the consulship, which he did. And we'll see his role in a bit. Senate also created the position of censor. The censor has the ability to strike anyone from the senatorial rolls when the census is published, essentially every 5 years. They could strike someone from the Senate roll, for example, for moral depravity. And we see that gets abused as well. The assemblies are the democratic element. There are 3 assemblies initially in the early Roman Republic. The Curiate Assembly is the oldest, but legislative power is eventually shifted to the other 2, the Centuriate and the tribal assemblies. They have the power to elect some magistrates. So, for example, consuls and praetors, and they could also declare war. But in the popular assemblies, the voting blocks are always weighted towards the aristocratic class. So those with money and resources would vote first, and their vote would count more than, say, a freedman voting and another voting block. It's kind of like packing and cracking and stacking. They would stack all the votes in different voting blocks, and the aristocrats had the most authority in those voting blocks. You also see the Plebeian Council. Becomes the main legislative body. It can only be convoked by the tribune of the plebs, and we'll see how this is used very effectively by the Grocky Brothers. But you see some very early on, I mean, this period, we're looking roughly at a 100-year period from 146. This marks the destruction of Corinth and Carthage, the end of the Macedonian and Punic Wars, and Rome by 146 is pretty much the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. The consequences of a growing empire, we see an importation of slaves, and a decline of the small farmer, and they made up the backbone of the Roman military, an increase in the freeborn urban poor, and there are many laws passed and how to deal with them. We see an escalation of elite competition, and also the growing importance of the military in deciding political affairs. During this period, we see, I mentioned the patrician and the plebeian, or the optimates and the populares factions. This relates to what's called the conflict of the orders. As the plebeians gained, one of their strategies to gaining power initially was the power of secession, secessio, as we see there. This meant that they simply withdrew from the city en masse. It was like a general strike. Commercial transactions would cease. And they first used this in 494 because they wanted to be freed from excessive debts. But they were able to through secession, they were able to create the tribune of the plebs, as I mentioned. And they wanted further reforms, like one plebeian would have to be in the consulship in conjunction with a member of the patrician class. You also see the growth of the equestrian order. They are a middling group. There's kind of a lower aristocratic class under the patricians. Some of the equestrians could become very, very wealthy. Basically through trade and business, because there were limitations on what senators could do in that regard. And they came to have more influence on the juries at the expense of senators. Next slide. So here we see just a good example of the extent of Rome's empire. The only thing that we would need to add at the end of our period down to Julius Caesar's reign is the addition of Gaul there. After his Gallic victories, Gaul is added to to the Roman Empire, as we see there. So really undisputed masters of the Mediterranean, the whole Mediterranean world. Next slide. Okay, so the Grocky Brothers. This is where we really start to see this conflict heated up between the optimates and the populares, or the aristocratic, the senatorial and the plebeian factions. The Grocky brothers came from a very famous family. Their father was a consul and a military leader. Their mother, Cornelia, was from a very distinguished family. Members of her family were basically the victors in the Punic Wars over Hannibal, for example, in the Second Punic War. So they're coming from an illustrious line. Tiberius, after serving in the army, was elected tribune in 133 BCE, and all dates, by the way, are BCE, so I won't keep repeating that. His main reform was an agrarian law. He wanted to redistribute what they call ager publicus, or public land, because what happens as slaves are being imported, we see these large plantations, what they call latifundia. Those are being worked by slaves to the detriment of the small independent farmers. So he wants to redistribute that land to shore up the small independent farmers who, as I said, made up the backbone of the Roman military. You could imagine that this senatorial class is resistant to this, because they're the ones that are benefiting from this, from holding the ager publicus to begin with. Tiberius resorts to some questionable tactics, and we see some dangerous precedents start to be set. And I should reiterate that questionable tactics are really on both sides, as we'll see. So, for example, he bypasses the Senate and proposes his reforms, this land redistribution, in the tribal assembly, which angers the Senate. The Senate then convinces another tribune to veto the bill. Tiberius takes an unprecedented step of asking the assembly to vote his colleague out of office. They do, and the bill is implemented, and a 3-person commission is established to redistribute this land. But Tiberius is facing another issue, and that is, once he leaves office, he's open to being prosecuted. So he takes another unprecedented step and stands as a candidate for the tribuneship for a second consecutive year. That had not happened before. And I should also say, when the land reform bill was coming up for a vote, the voting urns mysteriously disappeared. So like I said, we see these questionable tactics from both sides. But he stands for a second consecutive tribuneship. When the Senate fails to disqualify him through more legal means, they break up the meeting that he was addressing, and basically the senatorial supporters club him to death. 9 years after his brother's assassination, Gaius Gracchus assumes the tribuneship. And he is elected the following year as well, unopposed. So these precedences are cemented in further the further subverting of electoral norms. He tries to pass the same agrarian land laws. He tries to establish a grain law, or what they call a corn dole. This was to give to provide a monthly ration to the urban poor at a fixed price, and this is a very popular measure. He gave more power to the equestrian class. So, for example, the right to contract for the collection of taxes. The publicani were basically private citizens who contracted with the Roman state to collect taxes in Asia. That really falls to members of the equestrian class. So they have a larger, they are able to collect taxes more readily under the Grocky brothers, and they come to have a larger role on the juries at the expense of senators. one proposal that didn't pass was the extension of Roman citizenship and thus voting rights to a larger group of people. That is an issue that comes up repeatedly as well, extending citizenship to the areas surrounding Rome as this empire. As I said, the empire is expanding, but the city-state, Roman city-state itself is still quite small. And so this extending Roman citizenship comes up. Gaius experienced his downfall when he stood for a third term in office in 121. The Senate turned to violence once again, but with sort of quasi-constitutional overtones. They put up their own candidate for tribune, who was elected. Gaius and his supporters meet on the Aventine Hill. They decide to arm themselves in case there's any, for protection. And this allowed, just the fact that they armed themselves, that allowed the Senate to pass what they call a senatus consultum ultimum. Basically, they were able to declare Gaius Gracchus and his supporters as enemies of the state. So it gave moral backing to a senior official to take action against the Grocky Brothers and their supporters because they were concerned about the stability of the state. As many as 3,000 people died at that time. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've got this is one example of this heightened conflict that we see, and just a few years later, we see the same conflict playing out between the factions of Marius and Sulla. Gaius Marius, as you see here, he was from humble origins. He was a very successful military man. He was elected tribune, so he's coming from this Populares faction. He was elected tribune at the age of 38. He was elected praetor in 115, and he importantly made a very good marriage connection to the Julian clan. So by marriage, he was the uncle of Julius Caesar. As I said, he was a very successful military person. He took some questionable tactics as well. And when they were fighting wars against the King Jugurtha in Africa, he had the tribal assembly elected him as military commander, which was an infringement on the traditional prerogative of the Senate to make military appointments. He instituted another many army reforms. The most important was the recruitment of the urban poor. So it allowed landless peasants, the urban poor primarily, to become members of the army and to be paid that would increasingly come out of either Marius's own pocket or as we see later on, Caesar. So this is it becomes a very crucial transition where you see a professional army that is increasingly loyal to their own commander and not to the Roman state. Marius held an unprecedented 7 consulships. So this order of the Cursus Honorum is continues to break down. In order to pass measures that would give allotments of land to his soldiers, he turned to a tribune, Lucius Saturninus, to pass those reforms. So there was full voting rights for veterans in addition to land. And Saturninus has some questionable tactics of his own. In 99, there was a lot of electoral violence. He and his supporters smashed the voting urns when things didn't go their way, and they beat a man by the name of Memmius. He was a candidate for the consulship. They beat him to death. So we see an increasing use of abuse of the tribuneship and the use of violence in order to get reforms passed. The demonstrations against Marius were put down by Marius's own troops as well. And so the consequence was that whoever controlled the Roman army would control Rome. The Senate issues this Senatus Consultum Ultimum, this final decree, so to speak, against Saturninus, who is lynched by a mob, and Marius at this time goes into exile. There is war is heating up against Mithridates, who's the king of Pontus near the Black Sea, and so the Senate turns to Sulla as their military commander. Next slide. So Sulla, as you see here, he came from a moderately wealthy patrician family. He was a general during the Social War. These were allies of Rome that were pushing for full citizenship for themselves. And the Senate and Sulla were pushing back against that. Sulla is appointed by the Senate to lead the Roman forces against Mithridates. When a tribune tries to have that when a tribune tries to have that command transferred to Marius, Sulla marches on Rome in 88. One of the Cinna, who is consul in 87, he opposes Sulla. He tries to reintroduce some popularist measures like extending the franchise. And he raises an army of his own Italian volunteers to join with Marius, and they march on Rome in 86. Marius dies at that point, and Sulla cements his authority by restoring autocratic rule and senatorial influence. When Sulla returns from his Eastern campaigns in 83, though, he's not ready to give up that autocratic control, and he is opposed by the consuls in office for that year. But Sulla decides to march on Rome again and has himself appointed dictator by the Senate. So there's a veneer of legality there. He is somewhat of a harsh ruler. He institutes prescriptions, which is basically like publishing an enemies list and enemies of the state. This was a means to remove political opponents and also confiscate their property. About 40 senators are killed and 1,600 equestrians. He reorganizes the state, as I said, to give power back to the Senate. So the Senate then has the right to veto the act of any of the other assemblies, which had been the power of the tribunes. So he places that in the hands of the Senate. He doubles the membership of the Senate and adds 300 equestrians as well. And there were electoral norms in terms of like the magistracies. He instituted things like you had to wait 2 years before seeking in higher office, or 10 years before holding the same office, like say the consulship. That was in response to what we've seen, the unprecedented steps taken by Marius previously. He also establishes new courts to deal with the specific offenses like extortion, and only senior senators could adjudicate in those lawsuits. In 81, he resigns his dictatorship, disbands his legions, and restores consular government. In 79, he retires to his private villa and dies the following year. Next slide. Okay, so Sulla dies in 78, but these conflicts are not going away, and as we've seen, power is increasingly in the hands of one individual. I'm not going to talk about the social war. Unfortunately, the just in the effort of time, I'm not going to address the slave revolts either. You might know the name Spartacus, but they are indicative of the wider social unrest during this period. So the first triumvirate, this is established in 58, but we see Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar are the main figures here. And I also wanted to touch on Cicero because he gives us so much of our information about this time period. Cicero, as I mentioned, is a new man, a novus homo. He was a great orator, and that's how he rose to the consulship on his rhetorical abilities. For example, successfully prosecuted a man by the name of Varius for corruption in the province of Sicily, and that really put him on the map, so to speak. He was consul in 63. As consul in 63, he put down the Catilinarian conspiracy. This was a revolt against the Roman state. Catiline himself had very popular sympathies. They wanted to cancel debts, for example. And after the conspiracy was put down, the question arose on whether or not they would execute the conspirators. Caesar is the only one to say no, which signals his popular sympathies as well, and it also angered Cicero. So for Caesar, that was a bonus. Cicero is an enemy of a man by the name of Publius Clodius. Clodius was tribune of the plebs and a supporter of Caesar. They both drive Cicero into exile at that time. He returns in 57, but he is exiled for a time. Crassus is extremely wealthy. I think in my earlier talk, I had made comparisons to Trump. Crassus, for example, he bought up the estates cheap on the cheap from those who had been proscribed under Sulla. So he ended up owning a lot of tenement houses in the city of Rome itself. He led the forces against Spartacus in 73 to 71, and you see a picture there of the Appian Way where they crucified 6,000 slaves at that time after they put that revolt down. Crassus is consul with Pompey in 70. And again in 55 BCE, he becomes the governor of Syria, where he confronts the Parthians, but he suffers a terrible defeat and he's murdered while trying to negotiate the terms of surrender. Next slide. Okay, Pompey the Great, as he's known. He came from a very wealthy Italian provincial background. His father established the family among the Roman nobility, and he took Caesar's daughter Julia as his fourth wife in order to cement that bond between them. In 70, he's elected to his first consulship, while under the statutory age limit and without holding any other government office. Again, this is a violation of the normal requirements. He's a successful general, and he was a successful general. He raised his own army in support of Sulla. So again, we see this: Caesar siding with Marius, Pompey siding with Sulla. He has several victories over Marius's forces in Africa. In 67, Pompey receives a very unusual command, and this is to wipe out piracy in the Mediterranean Sea. So he receives imperium, like a provincial governor, for 3 years over the entire territory that covered 50 miles inland from the coast. So if you imagine all around the Mediterranean Sea, Pompey has imperium 50 miles inland throughout Europe, the East, and North Africa, which is an unusual command. And then the following year, he receives he receives the generalship against Mithridates, who is still causing trouble in the East. Next slide. Caesar, very distinguished patrician family, also again a very successful general and military man, as we see in his Gallic, his commentaries on the Gallic War that were very popular. Caesar's career path was a little more traditional. He followed the usual cursus honorum. He was elected quaestor ideal and praetor before becoming consul. He was also elected Pontifex Maximus, which is the highest religious office of the state. The Pontifex Maximus in some cases can halt proceedings or commercial transactions in the city if, for example, if the omens say that something, something bad is going to happen. He is elected consul in 60. He carries out some popular reforms, again, redistributing public lands to the poor, but he's always coming up against the opposition of the Senate. So this first triumvirate formed in 59 BCE, and each of these triumvirs, it just means a rule of three. Each of them have their own demands. Caesar wants to stand for the consulship in absentia, which was not a electoral norm. Pompey wants his arrangements in the East to be ratified and land given to his veterans. And Crassus, on behalf of the publicani or tax collectors, wants to revise the terms of the contract for collecting taxes in Asia. And the Senate refuses all three. And so they band together to rule and to get the reforms that each of them wants. They enlist the help of Publius Clodius, that tribune that was really Cicero's enemy, to pass these proposals in 58. But Clodius quickly turns against Pompey when Caesar leaves for the governorship of Gaul. And we see at this time Cicero is exiled because of his role in the Catilinarian conspiracy. To counter Clodius, Pompey organizes his own band of followers under a guy by the name of Titus Annius Milo. Next slide. So, but this is the conflict is heating up. There's a lot of chaos, and the beginning of the Civil War. In 49, what happens in 49? Caesar tries to force the Senate to agree to the proposal that both men should disarm, but Pompey and the consuls refuse that vote and declare Caesar a public enemy. This is when he crosses the Rubicon in 49 and marches on Rome. Caesar is declared dictator for 11 days at this point in order to quell this chaos. Pompey and his supporters flee east. He's defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus excuse me, I'm jumping ahead here. Excuse me, let me backtrack just a little bit. In 54, we see the death of Julia, who was married to Pompey, and the death of Crassus in 53. This is when the triumvirate really falls apart, and now it becomes Pompey against Caesar. Violence and disorder causes the consular elections to be postponed. In 52, Clodius is murdered by Milo, a supporter of Pompey. There's rioting following Clodius's funeral, and the Senate House, as you see pictured here, the Senate House is burned down. The Senate agrees to appoint Pompey as sole consul for 52. So then I said at 49, Caesar wants both men to disarm. The Pompey and the consuls refuse and declare him a public enemy. He marches on Rome in 49, declared dictator for 11 days. Pompey and his supporters flee east. They are defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece in 48. He seeks asylum in Egypt, but is killed by the king's officials there. Caesar, of course, stays with Cleopatra for a little bit. He's appointed dictator in 48 for 1 year. Okay, the next slide. In 46, while consul for the 3rd time, Julius Caesar defeats the last of Pompey's supporters and is declared dictator for 10 years, another unprecedented step. He also pushes through some popular reforms like debt relief and increases the size of the Senate. In 44, while consul for the 5th time, he assumes the dictatorship for life. And you see in this picture here, that statue, you see the SPQR, which is the Senate and the people of Rome. That's where the authority is supposed to reside traditionally. But underneath that, it says, to Caesar, perpetual dictator. So again, this veneer of legality on the dictatorship, even though these are unprecedented moves. So he's appointed dictator for life. This, of course, doesn't sit well with everyone. Brutus and a guy by the name of Gaius Cassius and fellow senatorial conspirators decide to take action against Caesar on the Ides of March. The next slide, please. You'll see here's an Italian painting of the assassination of Caesar on the Ides of March. Actually in the Senate House at the base of a statue of Pompey. That's supposed to be Pompey there in the statue, and the bust to the left, that is a bust of Brutus. So we see in 44 they're taking action against Caesar. They're not successful and they leave Rome. The following year in 43, Cicero is killed. In 42, at the Battle of Philippi, Brutus and Cassius decide to take their own lives because they've lost that battle. And it's really the last, it's at that point that the Roman Republic is lost. If you think of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Brutus is really the heart of the Republic. He just wasn't able to gain enough followers to solidify to go back to any sort of senatorial control. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about comparisons to our own republic. One of the advantages that we have is that we have a written constitution. The Romans didn't really have a constitution, what they call, like when Aristotle wrote his book called the Athenian, what we translate as the Athenian Constitution, it's really just a historical description of how the Athenian state was constituted. So Polybius's work talks about the makeup of the Roman state, but it's not a written constitution that we have. You know, this is a legal document for us. It's a living legal document that continually shapes our legal system. With this written constitution, we also see the growth of the concept of judicial review and the courts as an equal branch of government. I put an asterisk there just because that's a qualified advantage. I'll come back to that in a moment as well. But we also see in our Constitution specific Bill of Rights that grants freedoms to individuals. So we have more direct control over our public and personal selves, more so than the Romans ever did. In terms of notable parallels, the revolution to establish a republic, both in Rome and in America, is still essentially a conservative form of government. Power was weighted towards those with property, and it's conservative also in relation to other 19th or even 20th century constitutions written in the post-imperial period as well. So unlike the French Revolution, for example, Edmund Burke talks extensively about the French Revolution and why this gradual incremental change in English and in the English political system was much more preferable. We also see the use of political parties. Both Rome and America have predominantly two political parties that reflect the aristocratic and democratic elements of society. But some people think political parties work as a bulwark against extremism. I'm not so sure. I'm convinced of that. John Adams thought political parties were to be dreaded as a great political evil. We also see the dissolution of norms in both the Roman Republic and more recently in the last few years in our own government. The abuse of checks and safeguards to partisan advantage, if you think of the filibuster or even the electoral college, these were supposed to work to protect the political abuse and political power of minority groups, but they come to be like the tribuneship, they come to be used for partisan advantage. Voting, both weighted heavily towards property owners, as I said, at least initially in our republic. And I would say even after the with our modern economy and the expansion of voting, that's how it should work, right? But now we see restrictions on voting. One optic that comes to mind is the Georgia law in 2021. They passed it, so you know, voting restrictions, fewer hours, fewer polling places, things like that. But they also said they criminalized the giving of food and water to those in voting lines. And I thought that was very reminiscent of what the Romans did to exiles. They made it they criminalized the giving of food and water to exiles. And so they were essentially, I mean, to me, we're essentially treating those people as political outcasts. And that's, that does not work well in a fully functioning democracy. We also see unprecedented actions by persons seeking office. When Trump refused to put his business, to divest in his business or put it in a blind trust when he assumed office, there was nothing in the Constitution to prevent him from doing so. It was simply cultural norms. But those unprecedented actions, especially that where you see a blurring of public and private, it's a dangerous precedent. Like the Roman Republic, we see a government out of balance. The executive power assuming more authority during a crisis, or especially during a time of war, like the Patriot Act. That is a power that should be granted sparingly, and I think Congress had rescinded the powers through the Patriot Act previously, but when crises arise, we need to be careful to cede that authority to the executive branch. We also see the Senate as the world's greatest deliberative body, as President James Buchanan had said. The Senate is supposed to act as a fence to protect the people against their rulers. So it's supposed to act as a check on the executive branch. And it's also supposed to act as a check on what they call as James Madison called the transient impressions into which the people themselves might be led. So the Senate, as the main deliberative body, they work as a check on both the other two, the monarchic element and the democratic element as well. What we've seen in our own republic is this increasing obstruction by Senate, obstruction of legislation, not even coming up for a vote, and also the obstruction of court appointments when they refuse to refused a hearing for Merrick Garland. Again, that was another unprecedented move that has some dangerous consequences. Also, the populist sympathies in the Senate, as we've seen, for example, in the Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings. So that increasingly our Senate, by and large, one party is obstructing legislation and court appointments for their own partisan advantage. We see that and then the role of the courts. This has to do with the Kavanaugh hearing, and what we see is when the Senate or Congress refuses to act, that gets thrown to the courts to determine law. And legislating through the courts is dangerous. They're open to manipulation. We've seen they just had an election in Hungary, for example, and in Hungary it's the same thing. If you get enough supporters in the courts and you change the electoral norms, you can build in a partisan advantage to the detriment of our democratic ideals. Let's see. Did I have the one other thing? The use of violence. We're not going to see the armed forces marching on Washington, D.C., nothing like that. But the fact that so many citizens own guns and we see militias cropping up, state militias, militia groups cropping up. It's concerning. It's concerning to me. There was just an article in the Times about the proliferation of weapons as a dark form of American exceptionalism. Next slide, please. There are two important differences. One, our modern economy, of course. I really think that's related to opening the rights for everyone, as we see, especially post-World War II. And also this idea of federalism, the role of the states. In our history, of course, secession, our own version of secession, was used during just prior to the Civil War. States believed they had the power to secede from the Union. What we see, I think, with the obstruction at the federal level, laws are being decided through the courts, and then now with the, for example, the law in Texas on abortion, the enforcement of those laws is being outsourced to private citizens, and the Supreme Court doesn't have any. Basically, said they don't have any jurisdiction to decide on that law because the enforcement mechanism is not through the state itself. And that is dangerous. That we're going to see, I think, a growing divide between red states and blue states, and that partisanship isn't so. I don't see that improving anytime soon. I guess I'll just put it that way. But one question I wanted to mention this is for libertarians and independents, and that is the consequences of privatization. I don't have time to go into that, but it is really concerning, because if the res publica is the property of the public and we outsource that to private individuals and corporations, where is our common interest? So, for one thing, don't normalize it. People have been saying this since 2016. Don't normalize these unprecedented steps that are taken by our elected officials. Try to find common ground with people of other political persuasions when you can. I'm like I said, this is really an appeal to the center. I think we need to keep voting access strong, and I would like to see more influence from third parties, so we're not having this one-on-one divide, because to restore the balance of this mixed government, it really I mean, how do we hold politicians accountable without being partisan? And that's really the key question. I would love to see ethics reforms for the court, especially the Supreme Court. These text messages between Ginny Thompson and Mark Meadows are concerning to me. And also a standalone bill on presidential divestment. For the president and the vice president, they should divest from their businesses or put them in a blind trust. And I think Congress should also look at transaction by members of Congress in the marketplace, in the stock market, because that blurring of public and private and the economic benefits to our elected officials in those situations, it opens us up to corruption. Next slide. So I wanted to end with this last quotation by Cicero. I really think it speaks to where we can come together. So he says, harmony is readily maintained in a state where everyone has the same interests. It is from incompatible interests when different policies suit different people that discord arises. If the equalization of wealth is rejected and the equalization of everybody's abilities is impossible, legal rights at least must be equal among those who live as fellow citizens in the same state. For what is a state other than an equal partnership in justice? And that's what I hang on to. So if we see an increase in violence and this mixed government out of balance, safeguards abused, it only takes a crisis for power to be given to the executive branch, and we become very, very close to tipping over into an autocracy. So that this equal partnership in justice, I think everyone would be on the same page in that regard. So that's it. The next slide is just some suggested readings. Thanks. I'm sorry. I'll take any questions you have.
Susan? Susan, turn on your sound.
Do you think?
Okay.
Do you think we have?
Okay. Yeah, we have a few questions. Not all to the point of, the questions earlier on about the Roman Republic itself, but there was one question about assassination, and that ties in with the violence. And she asks, assassination seems to be the way to overcome your opponents. Was this the normal way, or do these events just make history so they get mentioned more? Yeah, but although you made the point that there's so much more violence now and more people have guns, we don't have such ordinary assassinations as they did.
Mm-hmm.
Do you?
Not so much like they did, but if you think back to the 60s, I mean, I think about like the assassination of Martin Luther King, of Malcolm X, of Robert Kennedy those were significant. I mean, in terms of shutting down, especially in terms of shutting down what was the promise of the civil rights movement. Like I said, extending full political participation to everyone, especially through voting. So we don't quite have the same level of violence that they did, but it does concern me that people that are joining these militias and feel that they are the patriots, I don't buy that. I don't buy that, and I really hope we can come to the center and try to pass some sensible reforms in that regard, just for everyone's benefit.
Okay, and then the armies raised by the different leaders, are they like militias? Do they owe allegiance to anyone or any group but the person who hires them?
They are like militias, because you see, not only are the armies the armies themselves increasingly loyal to one person, like we see with Marius in the beginning with Marius, and especially with Julius Caesar, because they're being paid directly. I mean, like Julius Caesar is paying his soldiers directly, and so they are loyal to him rather than to the state. You do see slaves and freed persons of members of the aristocratic class as well would act like informal militia. So when you see the skirmishes in the, for example, when bills are being brought to the Senate, they are kind of like informal militias, and they, they're ready to take action against their political opponents, because they feel that that's the only way they can achieve their objectives.
And this is an unusual question, put you on the spot here. Laura, do you think that we have a Brutus, someone who is our heart?
Well, I don't know. No one comes to mind. No one comes to mind, but I was just talking to a colleague at work about if you remember back in the 90s when they were pushing for campaign finance reform, and John McCain and Russ Feingold came together with the McCain-Feingold bill. They came together to push this legislation in a very bipartisan way. It didn't, as we've seen through the Citizens United ruling, those reforms are just they're non-existent at this point. So I think of, when I think of someone like a Brutus, I think of people like John McCain, like Russ Feingold, that are willing to put aside their differences and find some common ground to reach a policy that is beneficial for everyone, that's beneficial to the Republic itself. Nowadays, it's very hard to, I can't think of anyone now that would work like a Brutus, that would really encapsulate our best selves. I don't see it. No one comes to mind.
The whole concept is kind of out of style now.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, the rules and patterns, I guess, norms of government that the leaders were breaking back then. Who had developed them prior to where we came in on your talk?
I'm sorry, will you repeat the question?
The rules and patterns of government that the Grocky Brothers and others break, who developed them?
This was, and when the Roman Republic was first established in 509, it was, the bulk of the power resided in the Senate. So it was the Senate that we could say that it was the Senate's job to establish this, we might call it an informal constitution, I suppose, in terms of the rules and regulations governing like electoral offices, this cursus honorum. So it's really the Senate, but like I said, from a very early period, the plebeians felt left out. And so they, through their form of secession, they were fighting to get this tribuneship of the plebs established. So it's really starts with the Senate, but it grows to include the tribunes and the plebeians, and then of course eventually the equestrian class as well. So it's hammered out over the years through this conflict that we see.
Okay. Well, there's several compliments thanking you for the presentation and the very interesting points that you made. You scared somebody. I guess that was inevitable, but such great information. She says, thank you. There's a link on here to tell people to look on YouTube to see the presentation and the reading list that's suggested. So it was just very, very interesting, very enlightening, and it was kind of scary, but that's not your fault. And thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Susan and Gail and Jennifer and everyone at the public library. Thank you.